Okay. Well, welcome to our podcast. We got Catherine, Becky, and I'm Dakota. Becky, what are we talking about today? You go by Becky, right?
I do.
Yes. What are we talking about today?
Well, we were going to explore from the very beginning of the class, we had talked about how we can explore methods of cultural competency for diverse and multicultural populations. And we're thinking about our future practice, but also that we're living in fairly homogeneous locations. And how can that be something that we're regularly on top of if the people that are around us are by and large, look like we do. And so we thought it would be helpful to explore and discover ways to be on our toes, best foot forward to consider multicultural competencies in that light, in that regard.
Yeah. So, what was most challenging for you guys when it came to a component of multicultural growth? For me, it's been the the knowledge piece. Um, Certainly awareness, knowledge, and skills. Those competencies are all important to competency, and awareness certainly isn't without its challenges, and skills won't be either. But um, I feel like in this course, something that I grew in was the knowledge piece, just knowing about other cultures, um, and laying that foundation to understanding the various different cultures out there. From we've discussed everything from race to class and sexuality and identity, and it's been really great to sort of lay that foundation. And as Sue et al. Say, to use that as a platform to jump off from, getting to know the
Mhm.
individual clients
Mhm.
that will be in front of us. So the knowledge piece was really great. I felt like we talked a lot about the competencies throughout the course. Our program has really integrated multiculturalism into each course, which has been great. But I was really super excited to get down to the details of the cultures. It's
Mm.
We talked a lot about you got to know, you got to go, you got to know, and you got to know. But I'm like, okay, well, I would like to get to the knowing part, and so learning about those different cultures, everything from African American to Native American and Latinx, and all of those different cultures that I'll encounter with, and learning the differences between me and how I think and how others think. I've even noticed my everyday interactions. I'm starting to be a little bit more aware of where I might differ in my thinking from somebody else, and so the knowledge piece has been great, just to so I can start seeing those differences.
So if it's okay, I would like to chime in, Dakota. Um, One of the things I was excited about, or I should probably preface it, as a Hispanic woman from a region primarily made up of Hispanics, I I came in understanding the importance of multicultural growth in the counseling field, and I knew that it wasn't just about professional standards or just ethic or the ethical standards about serving the communities with a cultural sensitivity and respect. So one of the most impactful takeaways from this entire course was the importance of continuous self-reflection on our part and the learning process in addressing the multicultural challenges, especially within our own cultural community. I believe it's really taught me that it's essential to recognize and confront biases that we may have or that may exist even within familiar cultural contexts that we're from or we're familiar with.
Yeah, I would say that similar to what both of you were saying is that, when I'm going to do something simple like go to the store and, some kind of thought that you normally don't pay attention to or something, I'm paying attention to things that I'm thinking more and analyzing them as far as how I interact or not, I don't just like paying attention to that sort of quiet voice inside your head, not in a schizophrenic way. But that just I'm not sure if I'm being very clear on that, but just to check my biases that I'm bringing. And I think for me, that was one of the challenging parts, and mostly because I know that they're there. And so when I engage with people of color or different religions or sexualities, I'm get to be a bit of a chicken on saying something because I don't want to be offensive. And so that can be masked as more of a silence than engagement, and that no, so that probably was a challenge that I had going into it. But I still do, but I feel like I'm equipped better to be able to not feel like questions that are meant well or intended to be inquisitive are not crappy. And then on top of that, being okay with, if you don't know, you don't know. And if somebody educates you, that's a good thing instead of you were wrong before you started. So that was one thing I've had to wrestle with a little bit. Just calm your hubris down, Becky. And if somebody teaches you something, that's a good thing.
Yeah, that is a great approach to it, because it certainly is a challenge addressing it. And like you said, when you don't know, you don't know. We have this lifelong learning approach to multiculturalism. Like that's what cultural humility is, right? Is that, as they say, is that approach where we're always learning. We'll never actually quote unquote reach multicultural competence. It's a lifelong journey, which really sort of helps it to feel a little bit less scary,
Yes.
because you have that mindset that you're always a student. And I think that that's a great point when it comes to approaching the challenges, having that cultural humility. And I also think that learning about identity has been really useful. Both the racial and cultural identity development model that we learned about in the text, but also learning about the white identity development. I had not really considered my own development from a white perspective. I guess that would point to my privilege that I didn't really have to consider, that whole struggle around racism, but I found the identity model really enlightening and helping me sort of see my journey, because one thing that stood out from the model was that you can slide back into that conformity stage. And it's easy being a part of the dominant culture where you can go hide and behind everybody else says and does this. It's easy to avoid those uncomfortable conversations with others and clients. And like the whole idea of color blindness that I grew up around, I was like, wow, what a great point that saying colorblind is really just ignoring all of the differences that we should actually be celebrating.
Mhm.
And so that was a really aha moment and helpful in approaching the conversation around racism.
I actually, when I was in seminary ages ago, was where I first learned to understand my own whiteness. And one of the books, and I referenced it in one of the discussions a while back, probably the week that we talked about whiteness, but it was called Learning to Be White. And it's a helpful guide, it's a helpful tool to understanding what power and privilege is are just instantly there. And is, as you said, to that being colorblind is not the way to go.
Mhm.
Well intentioned as some folks may be, it actually perpetuates the racism that is there.
So, in my personal experience in just being raised and born and raised in a predominantly Hispanic community, there were also instances where colorblindness would manifest itself in our own Hispanic communities. There were always a lot of issues with race, with other individuals' ethnicity, their identity. So it's always it's always been a very complex issue. Um, but with this course, I've learned that it's a challenge that needs to be addressed, and there are various avenues of educating yourself and self-improvement in general. Through the course, through various conversations with other classmates as well, I've learned that just engaging in just literature or attending workshops, which I honestly haven't had the opportunity to do so, but just something as simple as actively seeking out different interactions, personal interactions with people from different backgrounds or ethnicities, identities, whether that be sexuality or anything of the sort, and just with these individuals in order to be a little bit more culturally sensitive when approaching. Sometimes you may, like you said, Rebecca, sometimes you may be coming from a good you don't mean any harm, but it's still it can come
It's
off as
still
ignorant
harmful.
sometimes. Yeah, it's still harmful. You're not acknowledging the their differences or their backgrounds.
And it kind of just like wipes away the oppressed experience of another group by saying, oh, but we're all the same. No.
Mhm. Yeah, you're not acknowledging it's become a huge topic where I work at, and by listing all of these or just saying that, hey, like we're all human beings, we all go through the same thing. Well, that's not true. And sometimes people from different groups do experience significant oppression and discrimination. And it's important when you acknowledge those things, you're also acknowledging their resilience and the way that they've been able to move forward from those sorts of experiences.
Yeah.
I agree. I think, yeah, we talked about microaggressions in this course, and I think that is certainly sort of along those lines of microaggressions where you micro invalidate, and that's something that can
Yeah.
happen in counseling when we make those sort of statements. And I had an opportunity to educate one of my team members here about microaggressions, and it was around the topic of racism. It was this poor guy's first day on the job. I'm in a retail environment, and it's his first job ever too. He's grown up in a very homogenous community. He has really not known anything else outside of this, and so he was in the store learning about the product and using his iPad tool to do so and I wasn't out there when this happened, so he's telling me. He said that the guests, they were African American, walked through the door and said, and they, I guess they started looking around, and he was near them with his iPad, and he said that they approached him and said that he didn't need to follow them around, that they're not going to steal anything. And he was stunned. He didn't know what to say. He thought they were kidding at first. And the conversation ended in confusion, and they left the building. And so I think it was his first day of training too. So I was excited because I had this unique opportunity to discuss what was happening there, and because he had no idea, and I got to explain about how they have likely their entire lives had to endure constantly being observed, watched, and made to feel as if they're not welcome or they're going to do something wrong. And it's not necessarily his fault in that moment, but that this was the result and a great example of unchecked bias, and when we just assume something's going to happen based on the color of someone's skin. And it's discussed a little bit about what microaggressions are and why that sort of wears down on somebody and produces, these sort of reactions, and ways that he can be aware and learn. For example, it's just interacting with other individuals that are different from him in different ways, and learning from those experiences. And so it was really great to have that conversation around it, because it had happened to me here before as well. Like that wasn't just a him experience. I'd always also experienced the same thing, and I understood. I get why they would have that reaction. It doesn't feel great in the moment. It's like, oh gosh, what did I do? What could I have done differently? That sort of thing. But yeah, just I was has my orientation towards multiculturalism and diversity after this course has been I see myself as sort of an educator role, and I think might carry on into counseling when I go and become a counselor. I enjoy teaching and developing others, and I think that multiculturalism is going to be a thing that I will make important and find ways to educate, even if it's just on social media, having a page talking about that information. I really see that as probably an advocacy route that I might.
Yeah, for sure.
Agree.
It's funny that you say you're like, oh, we're learning this wonderful stuff and I get to try it out. And I actually in church the other day, I don't even remember what sparked this. But I was like, well, I just learned about historical trauma response, and was kind of explaining that to some parishioners, and then they had actually just been to a funeral for a man who I don't know, but there was somebody there who was a Vietnam veteran, but he was he's a big chief or something like that. That's what she used. The word she used was chief in a Native American tribe. And I don't even know if she told me which tribe, which has its own layers of racism right there, but to try and explain to them some of the historical ripple effects of that trauma that people have endured. And And I thought they were gonna, not so much her, but her husband, I thought they were gonna uh kind of shrug me off or blow it off or whatever, but they didn't. They listened, and they were like making comparisons to their experience of what he was, stood up and was telling his story at the funeral reception about various things and his experience. And so they were equating what I was saying there, and it was kind of cool.
I love that. Special moment.
Yeah.
To touch on like the microaggression topic, I'm going to share a personal experience. When I went off to college, I went to, like I've mentioned multiple times already, I went from a predominantly Hispanic community to a mostly white community. So I was volunteering there at a research lab, and there was a person who walked up to me and asked me, they said, "When did you get here?" And I said, "Well, I mean, like today? Well, I just got here right now." They're like, "Oh no, like, and they're like, "No, like, when did you get here?" I'm like, "Oh, you meant like to college, like to this town." And I'm like, "Oh, like a year ago?" And they're like, "No, like I meant like to the
To this
country." She's like, "Where are you really from?" And I was like,
America.
"Well, I was born and raised here." So that sort of microaggression,
Yeah.
like despite being born and raised, not necessarily in the same community, but in the same country, like it was the first time I ever experienced that, because I did come from a homogenous community, and it was very eye-opening. But
I love that you were like an hour ago.
an hour
Right.
ago, I just got here.
That's awesome.
But it was I honestly, at the time, I didn't have, or I didn't have the knowledge. I hadn't gone through these courses, so I don't think I was well equipped to handle the situation. Honestly, I got a little bit upset and I just
Mm.
went silent. But that was a couple of years ago. However, I think using the knowledge I've gained from this course, I probably would have tried to raise awareness for this individual,
Mm.
whether it would have been through that conversation, just talking about it, just to speak up when those sort of things happen, and doesn't even have to be aggressively. It can be calmly, as long as it's assertive. And I'm not sure how how it would have gone over if I would have done it back then, but I feel like now I think I am equipped to do so. I think I would have approached it a lot differently.
Yeah. That's a great point. Is like when and how we address these things.
Hmm.
Because like I'm a little bit impatient. I'm like I want world change right now. Like
Me too,
and
Dakota.
I just like I like shoulder it all, and I'm like we're gonna go out here and change the world, and the idealist in me, but I also have enough life experience to realize that that's not super realistic, but that but what is realistic is starting where we are, right where we are, and with whoever we're just talking to and having discourse,
Hmm.
and finding those moments to share that information. I think in terms of advocacy, um, that's something we can all do right now. I think we all took a course for the college about uh, sort of what to do with harassment
Hmm.
and sexual harassment, where you had like the 3Ds, um, and the whole message was if you see something, do something about it, whether it's
Yeah.
distracting or addressing it directly. Um, I think that same approach is certainly applicable for situations like this, where someone is accosted for whatever reason, whether it's religion, sexuality, ethnicity. I think that same approach really applies. We can all say something in the moment, and I think that
Mhm.
is one thing that we can do to be advocates right now, and that can develop more towards joining different groups later on in our professional development. But yeah, that's what I thought about advocacy.
I agree. I agree that we can do a lot in the position that we're in right now. Something as simple as just promoting awareness, like encouraging individuals to educate themselves about the different forms of their microaggressions
Mhm.
and the impact that these microaggressions can potentially have on the people that they're directed to. Speaking up for others, that just by empowering these individuals and to challenge those microaggressions when they occur, either by directly addressing them or addressing, I don't want to say the perpetrator, but the person who is who is responsible for those microaggressions, and just by supporting those people that it's being directed towards.
I heard Brene Brown once said that when people are doing their own thing, whether it's good, bad, in the middle, no matter what, that they're doing the very best they can. Now, does that say, you can excuse the behavior? No. But it helps kind of put into a perspective of a lot of people, certainly not all, but a lot of people really are doing the best that they can and just don't have the equipment needed to make better statements or something. And so for me, I've thought a lot about that little gem that I heard in one of her podcasts in reference to being more vocal when encountering someone who's saying, whether implicitly or explicitly. I think those that are saying things more explicitly, one can question whether or not they're doing the best they can. But especially like where the microaggressions and implicit bias and things like that come into play, that it helps sort of dial back that instant anger response to more of a thoughtful, educational advocacy response.
That's a really great point. Just that, yeah, having that understanding that they are doing the best that they can. It may not be great, and we can recognize that. Brene Brown is wonderful. I love her. I loved her work on vulnerability, which I think is certainly relevant here. She
Yeah.
does a talk around shame and where it comes from, and it's really why we hide. People who don't have that shame problem and are okay with being vulnerable are authentic. They're okay with who they are, and that allows them to be more open and have those discussions. And it's risky, which is why we don't do it. She said we are the most obese, over medicated society in history, and it really comes down to this inability to be vulnerable and like I think that that's really applicable, especially with this whole colorblind white people thing. It's we're scared to be called racist, but
Yeah.
we need to
Yeah,
learn.
which I think goes back to my earlier point too, with that I would find myself being afraid to say something out loud because I didn't want to do that not being vulnerable.
But it's beautiful, it's authentic, and it's something we should embrace. And sure,
Yeah.
it's not easy, but I think it's certainly the path forward is having that conversation. But when we allow that shame or that fear to really, we kind of retract, and we don't want to have those discussions. And but those discussions are vital. Dr. Mahzarin Banaji did the work on the implicit bias and the implicit bias assessment, the test. I believe we took that earlier in the modules, but she was on Speaking of Psychology, the flagship podcast for APA, and she did an episode around implicit bias, and she discussed her work on it, and she believed that it wouldn't be changed because when they tried to change implicit bias, that automatic thinking that we learn through culture and our socialization, she couldn't find that it really changed. Maybe they could change it for a moment, but the people always reverted back. Well, one of her students she's working with convinced her to go back and look again and measure the implicit bias. And they measure it in multiple areas, including obesity, ageism, um, skin color and ethnicity and sexuality, and another place. And so they measured all these implicit biases again, but they saw this massive movement in sexuality. There was a drastic change in people's implicit bias towards sexuality over the course of her research. And there was some movement in like skin color and ethnicity, but not as much as there was in sexuality. And she started to question why. Well, they realized that it came down to two fronts. There's the private and the public fronts that you really fight these biases at. And she found that for sexuality, the private and public fronts both moved at the same time. So what was happening was people were coming out to their families and they were faced with this cognitive dissonance of, gosh, do I accept them or do I reject them? And while at the same time, public policy was changing and the public view of sexuality was changing. And so because they sort of coincided together at the timing, the implicit bias and that changed for the better for sexuality. So like that really speaks to, we have to have advocacy on the public policy front, and then we also have to have those vulnerable discussions in private.
Yeah.
I agree, Dakota. I would even go and say that vulnerability, as although some people see it as a sign of weakness, it's rather, I feel it's courageous. And in the context of microaggressions and combating those microaggressions, believe that vulnerability plays a very crucial role in acknowledging and addressing our own biases and our privileges. And I like it because it might require ourselves and others to examine our attitudes, whatever they may be, our behaviors, even when it feels very uncomfortable, because it's not an easy thing to do. It's courageous, but it's a very difficult thing to do, to put yourself in that position. But embracing your vulnerability and embracing our own vulnerability, I think we can help create those authentic connections and those spaces where we're able to have open dialogue and we can learn from one another.
Yeah, because that's where the growth is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So, two key takeaways for our audience.
I would say it's very important to continue to learn, to continue to gain knowledge. It's never ending. It's not like an elective that we can choose. I believe that cultural competence and multiculturalism is something that we constantly have to work at. Things are always changing, and there is never a point where you know everything. We can always learn just a little bit more.
I think it's definitely not one of those things that we put on the back burner either. We need to be working at it all the time. Just because our world gets smaller and smaller all the time, and we need to be prepared to compassionately understand our neighbors. So
I agree.
We'll keep at it.
Yeah, I would agree. It is a lifelong approach, and yeah, I think vulnerability, which actually is sort of a surprise topic of the podcast here, what I think really stood out to me. So thank you for bringing up Brene Brown and that, because I think It's a difficult, like, it's easy for me to sit here and talk about all the things that we can do, and it's harder to do the thing, to go out there and have those conversations and sit with that discomfort.
Mhm.
I
It's
agree.
easier to want to fix everyone else and not fix ourselves.
Yes, it's much harder to do some introspection.
Well,
It is the season of Lent, though.
anything else anybody wants to add?
I think we've covered
Think
it
so.
on my
Look at
end.
your list here, but I think so. I think we're good. It's always
Great
great talking to you guys.
Yes, a pleasure. And I think that we can end it there.
Yes.
Okay.